Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. And Kristen, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So today we're going to talk about operations one-on-one. So Kristen is the CEO and founder of Highliner Technology. It's a consultancy of senior startup operators. I can't wait to hear about your team because last time when we chatted, I was like, whoa, you have this person. It's amazing. I hope you can disclose it now at this point. And they work with ambitious tech companies like all of you here and just helping companies shift their gears and scale. Before that, Kristen was CEO of a deep tech company where she led operations and strategy up through their Series A process. But I want to let you dig a little bit deeper on this. But yeah, long story short, what we're going to talk about today, Kristen is going to share some insights on her experience with all the clients that they've worked with. And basically, we're going to talk about how to get your team ready on how to set up all the operational processes and how the strategy kind of translates into action. Like how to operationalize your vision, how to set up operational processes. And I hope to get into the really gritty details of some examples of things that didn't work out. But yeah, to kick things off, Kristen, it would be great if you can tell us a little bit more about your background and a little bit more about Highliner and then deep.
And then we'll go from there. Great. Well, thanks for having me. Hello, everyone. So as already stated in the intro, my background is all on the operations side. So I started on the people ops side, working at an organization where I was head of recruitment, and we were adding 800 people a year. So I got used to really intensive, fast, high growth businesses, and then moved into the more generalist operations side, where I've been a COO. I've done actually multiple interim COO gigs, helping all sorts of different companies, but fundamentally helping companies move from a current state to the next stage of growth. So how do we set our businesses up that in the constantly changing environment that is startup scale up, how do we set them up to successfully scale and bring our teams along with us? And as already stated, Highliner is essentially a team of senior operators. And we do this with a variety of companies. My team include people like Jonathan J.B. Bullock, who was COO at SoftBank and first chief of staff at Google. We have Dimple Patel, who was COO of Truva and then CEO at Truva, as well as a lot of different senior operators. And our goal is to, when we say operationalize your strategy, what we're talking about is at the very top level, you have this vision of where you're going, and you have a product, and this is what we're doing, and we know we're getting there. At the very bottom level, you have in the weeds, the detail, the code, the stuff you're actually doing day to day, the tasks. What is the key to happen is not just being at the top or the bottom, but there's a middle layer, which we refer to as operationalizing, which is kind of the plans, strategies, systems, processes you need to help a whole team execute. So I'm sure a lot of your companies are used to this, that when you're just a few people around the table, you're all just executing together. But when you get bigger, you need to think about, how do I enable a team to execute instead of just executing myself? And that's fundamentally how we frame and think of operations. I can jump on into and show this is how we think a bit about some models around operations, and then we can dig into some questions. Does that work, Mirella?
Yeah, perfect. Let's start with the frameworks and then we can go to the questions. I might also, while you're going through the slides, I'm going to turn off my camera. And then I will jump back in.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, so yeah, as Mirella said, this is operations 101. So this is kind of the key things that you should think about in that operations journey. And the first thing I like to show is that when we start to scale our teams, we build the best teams we can. So we bring on a series of top athletes, top players. But sometimes maybe it's after a funding round or kind of some sort of major shift in the business in that scaling journey, you realize you have this team of top athletes, but it feels and looks not like this kind of track meet, but a little kid's sports day. So people are not all headed in the right direction. So you have great people who don't necessarily know the right things to do. So operations is fundamentally about getting your teams ready, willing, and able to execute, particularly as you're thinking about that at scale. So ready means that they are recovered from the previous phase, that they are shifted into where you're going in the future, and they have an understanding of where they're headed. Willing is is there something that members of your team are stuck on that's stopping them from being willing to commit? And then able is, do they have the skills? Do you have the team itself? Do you have the right people in the right places and tools and responsibilities to execute? So that's operations can be a big amorphous thing, but we like to think about it as enabling execution and helping teams be ready, willing, and able. So to do that, we look at operations across a business. You need to think about your vision and direction, so the strategy, the big picture piece, your culture that encapsulates all of it. And then we think of people and team operations, product and tech operations that drive innovation, and revenue operations that marketing is usually under this too. And this is about driving expansion. Each of these areas have their own set of operations. There's both the cross-functional operations, and then each area will have their own set of ops. And last framework I'm going to show that will help us as we talk about specific examples is some big companies think of this as like their target operating model. But I think the easiest way to think about it is what you're building when you're first building out your operations is ways of working, the things that enable us to operate and execute. I know I keep saying that, but that is the key to operations. Like, how are we enabling our teams to get to where we need to go? To do that effectively, and as you're thinking about operations in your business, start by thinking about these simple areas. What are the roles and responsibilities? What are the cadence at which we're going to work? What are the mechanisms and shared language? So these are some of the more informal pieces. What are our formal systems and processes? And what are our source and truth and tools? Most people, when they think of operations, think of systems, process, tools, the last ones. I put those last because as you're scaling, the most important thing usually is to set up who is doing what, how, and at what pace, the cadence. The systems, process, and tools that enable those things. But really, when you're thinking about building out your operations, you're starting with the defining these first few places. So that is a whistle-stop tour of how we think about operations, but happy to dig into like some really kind of concrete and useful examples that might help teams.
Yeah, I was actually really curious when you mentioned operationalizing the vision with your team.
I think I made that term up, but yeah, go for it.
Because, you know, like sharing your vision is complicated, especially in a growing team. When the team grows, you don't know anyone by name anymore. So I was just curious, do you have any examples or from your experience or how leaders...
What does that actually look like? Yeah. How do you actually do that? So I think the first thing to say is that as a company scales, the founders, the CEO role, certainly, but a lot of founder roles and a lot of executive roles transition from the doing to enabling other people to do. To do that, you're just spending a lot of your time trying to clearly communicate with lots of different people what needs to happen. So the vision piece at the top line that you should be communicating is the direction you're headed. This is the big, what we're doing, the exciting, the making sure you're using the like starting with why. This is the more inspirational piece. And I think most of the founders I work with always say to me, oh, everyone always knows this. I say it all the time. It is remarkable, how little information all people take in verbally, but also at the rate of change of the businesses that we're working in, how much we think is obvious that hasn't been said. So my simplest advice to founders on your vision is first step is make sure you're bored of saying it. If you are not bored, like by saying the same thing about it, you have not said it enough to your team. So that's step one, make sure you're bored. And then, which is painful, but true. And then I think the other step is that, as I was saying at the very beginning, going from that top level vision, the big picture, exciting piece to the how are we going to do that? The simplest way to think about that is what are our plans and what are our goals that we need to execute on? So working with your exec team, and again, what's your cadence of this? Setting up maybe it's annual. At early stage businesses, it's even less than annual. Maybe it's quarterly. If you're running an OKR process, it's going to be quarterly. And maybe it's even less, but like setting up as an exec team, what are the big goals and milestones we need to hit? So to operationalize your vision, you first need to translate that big picture where we're headed into our goals and milestones. Then you need to empower your heads of your execs to build the plans around that to help align their teams. So essentially, all we're saying is say the same thing over and over but then build the space and be clear about who's responsible for what, clear roles and responsibilities, to make those goals, plans, the roadmaps of where you're executing to. That is where I would start. That is the first thing you should be thinking about. And I think, again, back to, it feels a bit obvious, but when we're scaling, we're used to just all being in the same place and be like, of course, people know what the plan is. Of course, you know what we need to do. But you don't as you grow. The other pushback is, why would we make a plan? Because everything changes every few minutes. We are still trying to figure out what we need to do. And what I like to say is your plans can feel more like a treasure map than like a full Google sat nav directions point A to B. And by that, I mean, like, at the beginning, you know the first steps, like you are taking 8 paces to the tree and then turning right. But then if you imagine like a little kid treasure map, then there's a forest and then there's a stream and you go around and you go through. You don't exactly know what that plan looks like at those stages, and you don't have to know, but you're giving people some key milestones to hold on to. And then when you change plans, you can say, this was the plan. We were going to go to the forest. We are now going to go the opposite direction because of this new information. That's actually a lot less disconcerting to teams than not having a plan to begin with. That we have new data and we are changing direction is a lot better than we don't know what we're doing to begin with and tacking a change.
Yeah, I guess like the plan changes all the time, but it's good to know where the direction is. And if the plan changes, that's fine.
It's fine. It's totally, and I think people are so nervous about like the team will feel whiplash because it's constantly changing. Your team's going to feel that anyways.
Yeah.
And they're actually going to feel it more because they don't have something to hold on to. And I think founders are super special, unique people in that their propensity to deal with change is really, really high. That's what makes them good founders. But you have to remember, not everyone on your team is like that. And actually giving them some like core, this is where we were, this is where we are, this is where we think we'll go, now we've changed that, actually helps smooth a lot out.
You also talked about having clear roles and responsibilities and how this is super important when it comes to setting up the vision and knowing where the team is going, especially in a growing team. And I think when scaling begins, there are 2 challenges typically develop. One being most of the tasks were done manually, and also everyone was responsible for everything. And now at some point, we need to have more clear roles and responsibilities and add more tools on how to scale all these processes. So any examples or advice on like how to set that properly? Because I feel like this is setting up yourself for success if the company grows. So how early we need to start thinking about this, and any things that gone bad with someone like that really.
Oh yeah. I think we wait too long to talk about roles and responsibilities because it can be sensitive. It's people's jobs and people are like, this was my thing and now it's not. So I like to think of it on a spectrum, and why we say roles and responsibilities, not job, is because it should be a constantly changing and flexible thing in a growing org, but that doesn't mean you don't communicate about it. So we talk a lot about, okay, what is my role and responsibility related to this project or related to this thing? Or if we're putting one of our current clients, we have a new product process that's going in. And we've done a big piece on roles and responsibilities on how people interact with the product process, where they have like decision-making rights, where they are putting in input, where they're moving into execution and who's doing that. That's not your job was this and now it's that. That's like, how do I interact with others in this space? And I would say you should be doing that as soon as possible and building that muscle and shared language about talking about that and the change to that. The other shared language we use a lot is like hats. Like we're all wearing different hats. In a startup, you're wearing 40 different hats at a time. This again helps make it a lot less about like, that's my job, you're stepping on my toes, that was my thing and you took it. And we talk a lot with early stage teams about like, think of all the hats you're wearing and think about which ones you're going to be handing off when. And for founders, we talk a lot about like, be clear with your team when you're wearing which hat. If you are wearing a CEO hat, like you're operating in a certain way. If you happen to be the CEO and you also happen to be running the tech team because no one else is, and you're kind of the CTO too, be like, I'm showing up now as the VP and engineer right now. because we don't have one. That way people kind of get a feeling of what role you're operating in. Or if you're showing up as an individual contributor, be like, I'm showing up as an IC here. We're on equal footing to like different ideas and different pieces. Like, so, because if you're the CEO, if you're showing up as, you are the CEO all the time, but it helps people be like, I'm here as an IC, which means I want more back and forth in this discussion. Please, or I'm here as a junior reporting to you because we need to get something done. But I think this concept with roles and responsibilities doesn't have to be like elaborate job descriptions that change every week. It has to be a like, who is responsible for what and what hat am I wearing at this time? As you get bigger, those things get more and more solid, but you create, because you get more and more specialized. As you get bigger, you have more people, so people are specializing in different ways. But if your early team is used to being like, I wore these 5 hats, now I'm going to wear this hat more and hand that hat off, it feels like less of a dangerous, this person's taking my job. It's more like, these are different things I do. It's a task.
Yeah.
So I like to think about it.
A very good friend of mine who's a founder, and I will always remember when he said that as a founder, the first thing you need to do is learn how to fire yourself.
Yes. And
Yeah.
I think that's really true, and learn when you're going to let those pieces go. There's an analogy that's been around forever, which is like letting your Legos go. And thinking about like, it's someone in Silicon Valley, I think someone at Google maybe came up with this as a founder. It's like, when do you hold all the Legos and when you're letting different pieces go? And what I say to founders, it's even more horrific than that. It's not just like, here, I had a yellow brick, I had this task, I had this work, and I'm handing it over. You have to think like, I have a Lego treehouse I'm building that is half finished, and I want it to be a Swiss Family Robinson treehouse. But actually, I'm going to hire someone in to run this thing, and I'm going to hand that whole role over. I'm going to give them not just a task, I'm giving them my treehouse to finish. If it must be a Swiss Family Robinson treehouse, I best communicate that clearly, or I need to accept it's going to be whatever their vision of a treehouse is, and that's fine. And I think that's the other piece when you're talking about roles. If there's something critical to a role, you need to be explicit as you hand that over. If it's not, you're going to have to accept that someone else is going to do it a bit differently than you would have.
Yeah, because everyone is doing it differently, and that's fine.
Yeah.
Now I want to talk about a little more about the symptoms of bad operations. And I feel like founders can like spot these symptoms before they escalate and become a big problem down the line.
Yeah, I think the biggest symptom to watch out for is you yourself being like that, back to that like starting line. It's, I have really talented people, but nobody seems to be doing the right stuff. So why doesn't my team, this person's smart, why aren't they doing what needs to be done? And then you need to hold up a mirror very fast and be like, because we have not clearly operationalized our vision. We have not clearly done the middle step to help them know what they need to execute on, or we have not clearly told them their roles and responsibilities, or we have not clearly set out what we need. So I'd say that's the first one. If you have team members who you think are good, but are not succeeding or not doing the right thing, look at that. Obviously, if you're seeing quite high turnover because of that, that's a very harsh symptom. But I think the first one is just, I have good people doing the wrong stuff. I think another really core symptom to see is, as organizations scale, you naturally get silos very fast. You hand over these hats, you define roles and responsibilities, and the people are like, cool, now I'm going to do this thing. That's what we worry about when we do that. So part of what you need to do in building your structures and building these handovers is also being like how people connect to each other. So one of my companies, for instance, scaled really fast. We went from 30 people to 100 people in a year, which is fast, but not crazy fast for a lot of our businesses. Strong execs grew very strong verticals, but we weren't mapping processes and we weren't thinking cross-functionally. So what we did for them is we looked at, like, we followed the user journey through the different teams. So think about from the point of like pre-sale, but think of them even before that, when they were marketing qualified lead, all the way to like the end user and what they're operating on. And we tried to think about the user experience through every part of the org. That then gave us a foundation to be like, wait a minute, there's a disconnect between what marketing and sales is doing, or there's a disconnect between what engineering is catering for. So I think, again, then we could have a roles and responsibilities conversation, not about like marketing does this thing, stay in this lane, about like, how do we relate to customers and how do we relate to each other? So that's just as important in your roles and responsibilities. It's not what do I do? It's how do I interact with other teams and where do we need to come together? And what's our cadence for doing that? As you get bigger, you bring in more tools to help you do this and more systems. You might have more formal sign-off handover processes, but at the early stage, map your user across the different parts of your org and think about your roles related to them.
Oh, in a way, it sounds so easy when you say it in such a framework and structured way. It's like, yeah, you just need to know where you're going, how to do it, and who's doing what, and yeah.
And you need to do it while everything's changing around you at all times. So that's what makes it so hard. And like, there are two things that make this really hard. One is the constant nature of change and the pace at which you need to work. So that is how everyone is exhausted. So it's hard to think about these big structural things when you're just going pace to pace. So I would say the other thing is, if everyone's feeling frenzied all the time and it's never ever getting better, then you need to think about like, what can I step back and operationalize here? And the other thing that makes it really hard is it's people. Like, this isn't like part A goes to part B and then everyone's happy. We think of operations not as systems and process, but where people meet systems and process. So these things actually take a lot of time, and you have to build the culture and the habit that we talk about these things and we hand these things off, and that's no big deal. If you start from nothing, then it's a lot of work to think of, to get people in the right mindset of how they're gonna kind of set these things up going forward. That's what we spend, I would say, the vast majority of our time is not in the like, oh yeah, you map this process and you do that. That's like the first thing. The rest is like, how do we help a team come along? Everything's changing in what we're doing, but also how we're going to work. How do we help them iterate and change there? And you shouldn't underestimate that. That is hard. And yeah, it's flippant when I'm like, you do this, done. It's a really hard thing, and it's okay, it's hard. That doesn't mean you're not doing the right thing.
Yeah, and I really like your analogy at the start that building a startup feels like the starting line of a race. Like, fire to go, and everyone's go.
And you're like, wait, what? Why are they not? I came up with that with the founder who had just raised their Series B. And the founder had been fundraising for the past 6-8 months before that. So he had done the pitch. He was bored of saying his vision, super bored. But he actually never said it to the team, or he did, but not the frequency he thought he had, because he'd done it so much with externally. So that's the other piece. It's like, you might be bored of saying it, but make sure you've said it to the team enough. And he fundamentally couldn't understand, like, I've told the team what to do. I've said, like, this is where we're headed. We were headed here. I've said we're headed there. No one's doing that. And we looked at it and we were like, well, this segment of the company is not ready because they're recovering essentially from like post-Series A trauma, like debt, bug fixing. This segment of the company doesn't have the skill sets they need to do it. So they're not able to do it. And this segment of the company is not willing to do it because of some issues that happened with this other thing that we did before. So we need to resolve those to get them willing. We need to get these people upskilled and new team members here. It's a simple framework, but it's very hard to make happen across a whole org.
A lot of food for thought. And yeah, I think I would love to leave it on that note. If there's any kind of last piece of advice that you want to share with the founders, it also like a reminder to everyone that Kristen is part of the Expert Collective. So you can always find her profile and request an introduction if you want to go a little bit deeper or anything ops related. So Kristen, any final advice?
Final advice. It is, building startups is hard. Everyone says it to you all the time. Finding product market fit, that constant iteration process, is really hard, but you don't necessarily need to do the same iteration cycle for everything as you're scaling. So I would say, like, reach out to people in your network, other members of the collective, other members of the portfolio. Like, how do you set up a recruitment process? How do you set up a sales revenue playbook? You're going to have to change things for yourself, but a lot of operational stuff I would say don't try and reinvent the wheel. Don't think of it as don't first principle it, because there are some very tried and true ways of doing it. So we're always happy to help, but also like there are a lot of people out there who have been through the scaling journey. And I think before you first principle anything, save first principling for your product. On ops, think like, what can I pragmatically recreate and reuse?
Yeah, I think this also aligns very well with the Seedcamp and the concept of the Seedcamp mission. Yeah, I mean, we've invested in so many companies. We have 400 companies now. All the founders have a platform where they can talk to each other. And yeah, it's all about not reinventing the wheel and tapping into the power of your community and network.
Yeah, tap into what's there. There is a COO network. And my favorite thing about it is it's an email listserv where everyone's like, what insurance providers are people switching to this year? And the answer always is, here's my spreadsheet of the research. So like stuff is out there. Ask your network. Don't try to go from scratch.
Awesome. Kristen, thank you so much. This was super, super, super helpful. And yeah, I will be sharing this to the founders. And then don't forget that you can all reach out to Kristen if you want to.
Always happy to have a chat about anything ops and growth.
Thanks,
Bye,
Kristen.
everyone.